Okay, so let's begin today with a little discussion about ATP. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, acts as the energy currency for the cells. So ATP is the molecule that the cells use for energy. Even though we get our energy from the food that we eat, the cells can't use that. They have to use this ATP. So ATP is going to store energy as potential energy. It's chemical potential energy stored in its last bond of its phosphate. And we'll show you that a little bit later on today in the video. And then this energy is then going to be converted to heat, or it'll be converted to the energy required for another reaction to occur, or it can be converted to kinetic energy. Okay, so the ultimate source of energy for us comes from our food. And food has what they call chemical potential energy, and that's going to be energy that's stored in its bonds. When those bonds are broken, it'll release energy that can be used for other things. Now, carbohydrates and fats are considered energy rich, and that's because they have a lot of bonds that are able to be broken to get this energy. And remember, we don't get the energy straight from the food, we have to convert it into ATP first. Now, about 60% of the energy we get from our food is converted to body heat, because remember, we're warm-blooded. Our body likes to run at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that being the case, we have to generate a lot of heat to keep our bodies that elevated. And when our bodies are that elevated, then digestion works as it should. So it's kind of like a self-filling cycle. We generate the body heat to stay warm enough so that we can have the reaction so we can generate the body heat. Now you'll hear an awful lot of talk about a calorie. For our case here, a calorie is a unit used to measure the energy in food. So the higher the calories, the more energy the food is going to have. But remember, it's not just about high calories, it's about smart calories. Okay, so let's talk real quickly about making ATP. What we're going to start off with is this molecule called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. That means it has two phosphates. So there's an adenosine molecule here, and it comes out and you have one phosphate and then another phosphate. What we're going to do is we're going to take that and that extra phosphate and take this energy from the food, and that energy from the food, when we break that bond, that energy is going to use to attach that third phosphate, and we end up with adenosine triphosphate. That adenosine triphosphate is what the cells are going to use, and what the cell will do is it'll break this bond right here and free up that phosphate one more time, and when it does that, that gives it the energy for the cell to do work. So that's why we say that ATP is going to be the currency, because it'll take that ATP molecule, this one, and then what it'll do is it'll break off one of the phosphates to get energy. And then we have this ADP, the remnant, plus this phosphate. We take the energy from the food and we're able to build it back into more ATP. So that ATP goes to ADP, and it's kind of a cyclic in nature, and that's how you can see here in the picture. Okay, well that's it for our video. We'll go into more detail on the lessons. As always, good luck with the lessons, and we'll see you next video. Okay, we're going to start off by talking about cellular respiration here. And cellular respiration is the fancy name of a cell taking glucose and making ATP, or energy, in a form that it can use. So while the cell itself can't use this glucose energy, it can use that energy to make ATP. And as we learned in our last lesson, ATP is what the cells use for energy. Now, a lot of times we get a little confused because we see this word respiration and we think about breathing. Well, one of the things to look at is in our equation, these are our reactants. This is what we need to have this work. So obviously, if we're going to take sugar, we need the sugar, plus we also need oxygen, which is what we breathe in. We breathe in the air to get oxygen out of the air. Then our reaction proceeds and we end up making the ATP that we showed you. We also make water, and then we're also going to have carbon dioxide, which is what we exhale out. So our breathing is a way of bringing oxygen in for this equation that we need for the process to happen, and then we also use it to get rid of the carbon dioxide, which is the waste product. That's what we breathe out. So you can see how even though respiration's in both, they are related, they're tied in together, but cellular respiration occurs in all the cells. All right, so cellular respiration is a interesting type of reaction. It's called a redox reaction. And if we split redox right here, you can see how we have a reduction but we also have an oxidation. So because we have both reduction and oxidation, that's why we call it a redox reaction. So let's take a look at the oxidation first. The oxidation is where glucose is going to lose an electron and a hydrogen. So our glucose molecule is over here. This is where we're starting at. And it's going to lose electrons. The electrons it loses are what goes on to form this ATP. But it also loses some hydrogen. So if you recall that glucose is C6H12O6, and we get rid of the hydrogen, then we're left with this C6O6, and we add a little bit of oxygen, and that's how we end up with our carbon dioxide. So glucose is being oxidated, and it becomes carbon dioxide. Now, we also have this reduction part of the equation, and that's where oxygen is going to gain some electrons, and it's going to gain hydrogen. So if I take oxygen and I add hydrogen in its most favorite way, it's going to form this water over here. So you can see how cellular respiration has this oxidation part and this reduction part, and that's why we call it a redox reaction. Okay, so that's the end of our video. As always, the lessons will go into them a little bit more in detail, so good luck on the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video. Okay, so let's quickly add an overview of respiration. What we're talking about is taking this glucose molecule and some oxygen, and we're going to break this glucose down into carbon dioxide and water, and that's going to yield us energy that we're going to store for the cells to use in the form of ATP. So here's our model of cellular respiration. Okay, here we have our glucose. The first thing the glucose is going to go through is this process called glycolysis. In glycolysis, it will produce a little bit of ATP, but it also converts the glucose into pyruvic acid. That then enters into the mitochondria, and it'll go through the Krebs cycle and generate a little more ATP and also the carbon dioxide waste product that we see. But then it also goes through what we call the electron transport chain, and that's going to make the bulk of the ATP here. So let's break down these stages, and we'll take a look at them one at a time and see what's going on in each stage. Okay, so the first stage of cellular respiration is glycolysis. And glycolysis happens out in the cytoplasm. And what you'll notice is we start off with our glucose here, and we're going to add some ATP energy. This ATP will break, and when it does so, it'll allow us to break this 6-carbon molecule of glucose into 2 3-carbon molecules. Then we'll take off a little bit of the electrons here, and we'll form NADH, and that's going to be used later on in cellular respiration. We also generate a little bit of ATP, but then we're going to end up with 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, and notice that those are both 3-carbon structures. So in glycolysis, what we're doing is we're taking glucose and we are breaking it down to form pyruvic acid, and then we get a little bit of ATP and then these electron carriers that will meet in the third stage. Okay, so let's explore the second stage of cellular respiration, and this is what we call the Krebs cycle. Now if you notice down here, our Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondria. And that happens in the matrix of it, or the fluid portion of the mitochondria. What we're going to do is we're going to take this pyruvic acid that we got from glycolysis. So remember, glycolysis broke down glucose to make this pyruvic acid. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cleave off a carbon dioxide. And that's going to make acetic acid. Now, acetic acid enters into the Krebs cycle, and it'll join with a 4-carbon structure to make a 6-carbon molecule. As this 6-carbon molecule proceeds through the Krebs cycle, we're going to break off some more CO2, okay, which will generate ATP and then also gives us some more of these electron carriers. Now, if I take this 6-carbon up here and I break off 2 carbon dioxides, then I end up with my 4-carbon that we started off with. Okay, so you can see how this is going to be a cycle. It'll be ready to accept more acetic acid, and that's how the process begins. Now, notice that we are generating this carbon dioxide, and this is the waste product that we have to get rid of. So this carbon dioxide gets into our blood system, works our way to our lungs, and that's what we exhale out. Okay, so we took the pyruvic acid from glycolysis, and we made some ATP, we got a couple more of these electron carriers, and we've started to create some waste products of carbon dioxide. The third and final stage is the electron transport chain. And this one here occurs in the membrane, okay, of our mitochondria. All right. Now what we notice is that electrons are going to come into here, our electron carriers. So we'll see these electrons here. So all of the electrons we've been storing up as NADH and things, those come here and the electrons go into this. And this is our electron transport chain. These electrons are going to migrate down as they go this way. Okay. And as they're going down this way, what they're going to do is take this hydrogen and they're going to pump hydrogen inside to the inner membrane space. Okay, so from the matrix, the fluid part, they're going to pump it into the membranes. All right, so we're pumping in those hydrogens. Now these electrons that are moving across, as you see through here, through this chain, they lose energy every step of the way. And as they lose energy, what they allow to happen is oxygen will come in here and it can bond and form water. Now normally if you take hydrogen and oxygen and you add it together, it's explosive, but because these electrons have been moving down the chain, this reaction is a lot slower, it's a lot more stable, it doesn't explode, and it's able to happen in the cells without any issues. Okay, now the last part is, after we've pumped in all of these hydrogens, all right, all of these hydrogens are now up here and we have the sufficient concentration gradient it wants to leave. It's going to leave through this ATP synthase. And as these hydrogens are pumped out, it's going to manufacture more and more ATP. And this actually generates most of the ATP in cellular respiration, is this last step right here. Okay, so that's how the electron transport chain works, and that completes our talk about the parts of cellular respiration. So just as a quick review, our three stages: first was glycolysis, then the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. In glycolysis, we start with glucose and that ATP, and we're going to form this pyruvic acid, okay, and we're going to make this NADH, which is an electron carrier, and then we generate ATP. So even though we're using a little bit here, we generate a little bit more. So the net result is a positive ATP, and remember, this happens in the cytoplasm. The next step was the Krebs cycle, and in the Krebs cycle, we added to this pyruvic acid some acetic acid, okay? And what we got out of that were a few more electron transport molecules, NADH and FADH2. We generated carbon dioxide, and we made a little bit more ATP. And remember that the Krebs cycle happens in the matrix, or the fluid part of the mitochondria. And then finally, the last step in the cellular respiration is the electron transport chain. And this is where we're taking our electron transport molecules that we've generated from up above, and we are going to make a whole bunch of ATP. And this happens in the mitochondrial membrane. So that's all I have for you, just a real quick overview. The lessons, as always, will go into it in a little more detail. Good luck on the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video. To begin, we're going to talk about two words up here you'll see. We have aerobic and anaerobic. And the key for this one is aerobic animals or organisms or processes use oxygen, where the anaerobic ones do not use oxygen. Now, anaerobic, we're going to talk about fermentation, and two of our products are going to be lactic acid and ethanol. Versus aerobic processes here, they'll use the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle on oxidative phosphorylation. So this is what they go through, and this is how they generate their ATP, which is their energy. We see that they both do this. Okay, so aerobic means they use oxygen. Anaerobic means there is no oxygen. So the first type of fermentation we're going to talk about is this lactic acid fermentation. In lactic acid fermentation, we're going to take this glucose molecule and it's going to go through glycolysis once again. So you'll notice that that process is consistent. As it's going through there, it's going to take NAD and form NADH, and then the byproducts, this pyruvic acid that we had before, is going to go through another chemical reaction where it takes the H off of the NADH, and we're going to end up with what we call lactic acid. And for us, we get lactic acid a lot if we're using our muscles and we're exercising a lot when oxygen gets depleted. So we're using our muscles more than we're able to breathe in the oxygen. then a lot of times we'll have this lactic acid build up, and that's what gives us like cramps and sore muscles and things like that. Okay, another example of fermentation is ethyl alcohol fermentation, and it goes through glycolysis, just like our other types of fermentation and cellular respiration. We start with glucose, we're going to get some ATP, we're going to convert some NAD plus to NADH, and we're going to end up with 2 3-carbon structures. In this case, it's going to be pyruvate. Now, this pyruvate is going to lose some carbon dioxides, and it's going to form acetaldehyde here. We'll then take these hydrogens back, and we will convert that into ethanol over here, or ethyl alcohol. And this is the net end result product here. Now, what happens when we're out of glucose? Because that can happen, right? The cell can run out of glucose. So then what happens to it? How does the cell get its energy? Well, they like it if they have polysaccharides, things like starches, things like glycogen, where they can then remove this glucose monomer one at a time. So then all I'm going to do is take this long string of glucoses, and I'll just break off one as I need it and use it that way. The other one are our lipids. Okay, remember when we talked about lipids, we said that those are molecules that were storing excess energy. Well, the cells are going to break the lipids into different molecules, and these different molecules will then enter into the stages of cellular respiration. So it's not going to form glucose, but it might form some of the later molecules that then can run through the cycle, and it can generate ATP that way. And the same is true with proteins, and this is one that's kind of dangerous. We don't like it when we start doing proteins because the cell is going to break it down. And remember, you're made of proteins, so it's kind of like your body is going to start breaking down itself to form these amino acids, which can then transform into molecules and once again go back into cellular respiration. So always best to have the fuel of choice, glucose. If not, the polysaccharides work. The lipids are not too bad, and as a last result, your body will start breaking down proteins and using those. Okay, so that concludes our video. As always, the lessons will go into it in a little more detail. Good luck on the lessons, and we'll see you on the next video.